Welcome back to Talk Back Live. I'm Michael Smerconish, in for Arthel Neville.
Well, Judge Reynolds thinks
Why do you think they're doing it? Is this just a fishing expedition?
Thanks. I'm CNN
one extreme or the other.
Jeffrey Toobin with Court TV's Lisa Bloom and CNN contributor Michael Smerconish. Welcome to Attorneys at Law.
Thank you, Rita. Right now in Scarborough Country, the lady...
Michael Smerconish got that name because they were trying to get even with him. Because I don't know what his parents were trying to do when they picked out Smerconish as a name. Jews have changed their names throughout history when they were called Bernstein or Goldberg. And they thought that somehow it's not such a beautiful name. But Smerconish, this is a hit. You couldn't think of another name. And you want to get even with somebody, so you look to me like a real Smerconish.
My guest tonight is a guy who gets it. He's an anti-PC radio host and author who says we're screening the wrong people at airport security. If it gets me to my gate faster, I'll agree with anything he says. Please welcome Michael Smerconish.
He's the host of Sirius XM's Reuters, the Michael Smerconish program, and CNN's Smerconish, and he's the author of Talk, a novel, Michael Smerconish. I've said Smerconish 3 times in one sentence.
And I watched on television today, and there were 2 young guys on CNN, on Smerconish, actually, and they were, who doesn't necessarily treat me good, but I'll give them a little free publicity because these two guys, they were delegates, right?
Both my parents are from Hazleton. So
I know Hazleton well.
We're both of coal cracker,
That's
Pennsylvania
right.
stock, right?
Do you know anybody at Hazel didn't want their kids to go to college, even though they never went?
Absolutely.
Do you know anybody who didn't want to have an opportunity to be able to have a decent job and have some dignity behind it? Donald Trump's offering nothing. Nothing. Zero.
If you hadn't played by the rules, you wouldn't have had issues with the system.
I always dreamed too of being on CNN and being able to express myself and speak for the voiceless young men of America.
And if you don't know that, you're not reading enough. Go and read about it.
Okay, did we solve anything here today?
Yeah, we did. Well, no, we didn't.
Nancy,
you're believing your propaganda, your side's propaganda.
You're defining it as
Taiwan.
propaganda. My problem is I spend too much time reading your liner notes, okay? Thank you for doing this. I appreciate it.
Talking to me.
All right.
It's always a pleasure.
Is it? Okay.
Jokers to the right, clowns to the left. Biased? Nobody's as afraid of jokers as they are about clowns. No, I'm casting equal aspersions on each. I think that people who hold views that are independent and not ideologically tethered have allowed themselves to be cast as being weak or as in lacking conviction. I have plenty of conviction on a whole variety of issues.
Put back on the screen the complaint from before the commercial break, because something occurred to me. Rajiv, who says, more than anything, the special counsel report about Biden is a gift to you in your crusade to make Trump president. No, you should be thanking me for the open airing on this program about the issue that is most of concern to voters, such that 3/4 say they're worried. They're worried. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to say that. Thank you all for watching. Hit the website. I'll see you next week.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for that. You're awfully nice. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I know what's wrong with America. I know what's wrong with our country. And it can all be explained inside the public school bus. See, more than half of our kids are now being driven to school in a private vehicle. The Washington Post was the first to have the story. They said that in some districts, they're actually paying parents to drive their kids to save the district's money. And I say, rest in peace, bus number 5. Because bus number 5 was the yellow and black that used to drive my friends and me to the Doyle Elementary School back in the day. And I'm talking about all the kids on the block. My buddy Dave McFarland, who lived straight across the street from us, he had a cowlick back in the day. I imagine he's grown out of it by now. Mike Stockel Jr., we're still friendly today. We lived at 24 Mercer Avenue. The Stockels lived at 42 Mercer Avenue. They had the only in-ground pool in the neighborhood. We called their house Stockel Valley Country Club. And Mike always used to wear an Evel Knievel costume on bus number 5 going to school. Tommy Kentop is in the blue jersey in the front row, clutching the football. He once terrorized a girl named Sharon Schradel on the bus. He got on the bus with his hands cupped together and he said to her, "There's a bee inside. Would you like to see it?" Lily Wodak is next to Tommy on the left side as you face Tommy. I remember the day that he turned his backyard playhouse into a make-believe church and then wouldn't let me inside because he said that I wasn't Catholic. Even my first crush was on that bus. Caprice. Where is Caprice today? I speak all over the country. One of these days, a hand's going to go up in the back of the room. She's going to say, "I'm here." And I won't know how to react. Up front was our driver, Mr. Larlick. We didn't know much about Mr. Larlick, only that he was a hard ass. I recently saw his bus driver ID. It's a funny thing about childhood memories, because if you had asked me, I would have said, Mr. Larlick, I don't know, 6'4", 6'8". I was surprised to learn that he was 5 feet 6 inches tall. Still, he did not hesitate to impose a little discipline. There was that night at family dinner when my parents asked my brother and me how our day had been, and my brother piped up and he said, "Well, on the way to school, Mr. Larlick shook up Chips Miller." Now, Chips Miller lived around the corner, and I'm sure he deserved it. But that he got shook up means that Mr. Larlick pulled that bus over to the side of the road, got out of his seat, came to the back of the bus, found Chips Miller, grabbed him by the lapel, and shook him up. The funny thing is that really didn't cause much curiosity from my parents, because that's the way that it was then. Our neighborhood was the first stop. And that's how we always got to sit in the back of the bus. Everybody wanted to sit in the back of the bus. The kids at the latter stop were always disappointed. Now, everybody wanted to sit in the back because, among other things, it was better for mooning opportunities. I remember the day that we got to Hillcrest Drive, and I looked out one of the windows, and I could see everybody was lined up for the bus as normal, except so too were their moms. Highly unusual. Mr. Larlick opened that door, and Jerome de Latour's mom got on the bus, walked right past Mr. Larlick, came to the back of the bus, and she said, "Make room for Jerome." Apparently, Jerome wanted to sit in the back of the bus. Now, this was a lesson in conflict resolution. We scattered like rats. My point is, I learned a lot on that bus, sometimes more than in class, not about the 3 R's, but about life, about social interaction, about friendship, and from Mr. Larlick, respect. And I get it, viewed in a vacuum, the fact that more kids today are being driven to school than taking the public school bus is meaningless, but I see it as part of a much larger, more troublesome picture. Because when parents drive their kids to school, it's one less opportunity for unstructured play, for social interaction, for personal growth. And I see it as part of a much larger narrative insofar as we're living in an age of conflict brought about by disconnect, which has frayed the fabric of our nation. It has polarized our politics. It has harmed the mental health of our kids. But I think I know how to fix it. So, at long last, welcome to the Mingle Project. You know, my start in radio can also be traced to that gang of friends from bus number 5. In Doylestown, Pennsylvania, we had a tiny radio station, 5,000-watt radio station. It was called WBUX, and WBUX transmitted from these 4 rusted towers in a cow pasture on the edge of town. And one summer in the 1970s, everybody on the block was recruited to sing a jingle for a local swimming pool company, Sylvan Pools. Before you take the plunge, be sure you talk to Sylvan. Before you take the plunge, be sure you get the facts. Family engineered for fun and recreation. Sylvan has the pool to keep you all relaxed. Second verse. Take your vacation right outside your home. It's so easy. Just pick up the phone and before you take the plunge. It's a funny thing. I am terrible with names. Terrible. I mean no disrespect if I should forget your name after we meet, but I've never forgotten that jingle. And when I recently found the script, it matched my memory. And thank God I had never KonMari'd it, right? Still brings me joy. So fast forward 19 years. It's now 1990, and I'm 28 years old, and my first talking radio appearance was as the guest of a guest talk show host on a Saturday night in Philadelphia. Except WWDB, where I appeared, was no WBUX. It was a big city monster. It wasn't 5,000 watts of power. It was 50,000 watts of power on the FM band, and it could be heard all over the eastern seaboard. In the 2 decades between the swimming pool jingle and now this radio appearance, I'd had these unique political experiences while I was still young. When I was still in college, and you've heard me tell some of these stories on radio, I was fortunate, I was privileged to work as an advance man in a volunteer capacity for then Vice President George Herbert Walker Bush. And then I ran some Republican campaigns, including, while in law school, a losing campaign of my own for the Pennsylvania State Legislature. Yeah, I lost by 419 votes and have since located 236 of those people. Eventually, I was invited to provide election night commentary for some of the network affiliates on local television and radio in Philadelphia. I was a young lawyer moonlighting as a talk radio host, but I knew then that I wanted to be in broadcasting. Things were different when I entered the talk radio world 3 decades ago in Philadelphia, initially as the guest, then the guest host, and then the host of my own program. The radio station where I cut my teeth was then typical of big market talk radio all across the country. In other words, in our primetime lineup, we had a conservative, Dominic Quinn. We had a liberal, his name was Frank Ford. We had a libertarian, Irv Homer. They talked politics, but we also had a real estate show. And we had a travel show. And we had a food show. And we even had a weekly sex show. And the hosts, what they had in common, these hosts were all local and they were all characters, especially the host of the once-a-week sex show. My favorite, Dr. James A. Corey, who every other night of the week hosted a show on physical therapy, but he'd come in, I think it was on Thursday nights, and he would transform himself into the Love Doctor. I remember 2 things about the Love Doctor. First of all, he would wear gym shorts 365 days a year coming into the studio regardless of the temperature outside. The second thing that I remember is that the only advice that I recall him offering was for guys. 1 word: cologne. It's worked for me ever since. I'm wearing some right now. Getting started, I often guest hosted for our evening host, Bernie Herman. Bernie was on from 10 p.m. until 1 a.m. I was practicing law and doing guest hosting for him. Now, the funny thing about Bernie is that his shtick, his moniker, we didn't call it brand then, is that Bernie was the gentleman of broadcasting. He would come on air and he would say, "Good evening, I'm Bernie Herman, the gentleman of broadcasting." Today, you're not getting hired with that as your signature, right? But back then, it was different. Back then, our job, our mission was to sustain a conversation, tell stories, offer expertise if you had any. There were no ideological litmus tests. Your political party didn't even matter then. Hard to believe today. We were evaluated not by ratings so much as our ability to make the telephone lines ring. And this was the environment in which I got my start. And I was so damn excited when they printed my first publicity picture at WWDB. I know what you're thinking. Not exactly a guy who looks like he's loaded with personality, right? And I admit to you, the ego of it consumed me, and I hoped that I had a skill set. And from that point until today, it's been a long time, I've never left the television or radio airwaves. Not only was the radio climate different then, but so too was the political climate. My wife and I have 4 children, 3 boys in their 20s, a daughter who's in her 30s. They and other young Americans have never known any climate other than what we have today, where it's the far left against the far right. And I keep telling them that it hasn't always been like this, that if you go back as recently as the 1980s, on Ronald Reagan's watch, Tip O'Neill was the Democratic Speaker of the House. So you had Tip O'Neill, the liberal lion, and Ronald Reagan as the conservative Californian, except they got along. They got along. Reagan hosted O'Neill for his 69th birthday at the White House, and he proposed an old Irish toast. He said, Tip, if I had a ticket to heaven and you didn't have one too, I'd throw mine away and go to hell with you. Now, can you imagine Trump and Pelosi or Biden and Johnson, having such a moment of warmth? Of course not. Something else. According to the National Journal, which used to track congressional voting, they would take a look at votes where you could determine someone's ideological leaning. And then they would figure out how many conservatives and how many liberals there are in the House and in the Senate. 60% on Ronald Reagan's watch, according to the National Journal evaluations, 60% of the House and Senate, 60% of the Congress was then comprised of moderates, meaning Democrats who had voted more conservatively than the most liberal Republican, and vice versa. There were so many Republican moderates in the United States Senate on Ronald Reagan's watch that they had their own weekly gathering. They called it the Wednesday Lunch Club. And you'll remember, if not visualizing, at least hearing some of these names: Alan Simpson and Ted Stevens and Nancy Kassebaum, both of my United States senators, Arlen Specter, John Hines, Bob Packwood, Bob Dole. At that time, both major parties used to crow about being the party of the Big Ten. But of course, today, the Wednesday Lunch Club, they couldn't fill a high top for 2 on Capitol Hill. So what changed? A number of things. The rise of media personalities who have this hold over primary voters have shifted the debate to the extremes. And that was then accelerated in the 1990s when a number of hosts were put into national syndication. It was the end of the local characters, if you will. And suddenly ideology was king. And when cable news then launched in the mid-90s, cable news took a page out of that AM terrestrial talk radio playbook. And you can pick your poison. Fox News on the right, MSNBC, and many would say CNN on the left. This polarized media is great for ratings and revenue, but bad for the country. And I don't see correlation. Sure, that deserves a round of applause. I don't see correlation between a polarized media world and a polarized Washington. I see causation. And I'm not alone. The late, great John McCain said the same thing before his passing. It came in 2017. He was 80 years old. He'd just been diagnosed with aggressive form of brain cancer, a glioblastoma. And he made one of his final Senate speeches. And in the well of the Senate, he spoke of what I'm now addressing. I want to get it exactly right. McCain reflected on his decades in the Senate and the demise of the Senate as the world's greatest deliberative body. And then he said, stop listening to the bombastic loudmouths on the radio and television and the internet. My favorite part, that which I have committed to memory, he said, our incapacity is their livelihood. Think about that. The Senate, our incapacity is the media livelihood. He knew that it's mostly men with microphones have too much influence. And when politicians take their cues from the pro wrestling of the modern media, the nation suffers. The nation suffers. Mostly for the guys, but how many can you name? On the left, Bruno, right? The living legend. Come on. Bobo Brazil is on the right. My favorite in the middle. I can still imitate his war dance. Chief J. Strongbow. Okay, I don't know how all of you spent your Saturday mornings, but me, I was parked on a beanbag chair watching, UHF or VHF. I still can't tell which was which. We've got a media today and political leaders who framed the debate but are out of step with the rest of the nation. In January of this year, Gallup, they do this with regularity. The last time they did it was January, and they surveyed people's leanings and how they identify as between the parties. And what did they find? 43% of Americans say, I'm an independent. I'm not an R or a D. 27% said Republican, and 27% said Democrat. Now, you would never know that from who gets the most attention in this country. Instead, it's the extremes. It's the Freedom Caucus or the Squad. A couple of years ago, there was a huge survey taken. It was called Hidden Tribes. 8,000 people were questioned. They were trying to understand the depth of polarization. It found that 14% of Americans, only 14% of Americans, are at one end of the spectrum or the other, the ideological spectrum. And I'll be presumptuous, and I'll say, and 86% of the rest of us are somewhere in between. Something else that's interesting about this is that the data says, in contrast to many of our perception, that in the last 50 or so years, there hasn't been a sea change difference on the fundamental issues in terms of Americans and where they stand. That's the reality. And that was the finding by Dr. Morris Fiorina at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. He wrote a book called Unstable Majorities. And the argument is that on issues like abortion or on issues like guns or on issues like the death penalty, we are pretty much where we were in the 1970s. Then our belief system mapped to a bell curve, and today it maps to a bell curve as well, just like the way our papers used to be graded. But we've allowed this system to take hold that benefits politicians and the media who make us think otherwise. What are they after? Radio ears and TV eyes and website mouse clicks. The polarized media and the polarized politicians are dependent upon convincing us that everyone is either far to the left or far to the right, like a barbell instead of a bell curve. Now, a lot of other factors besides the media have contributed to polarization. They include a lack of campaign finance reform. In fact, let me stop right there. It used to be that if you ran for Congress and you were elected, you'd relocate. From wherever you were in the country, you'd go to Washington, you'd bring your partner, your spouse, and the kids would be enrolled in school, be it a private school or even the D.C. public schools or the surrounding Virginia and Maryland schools. And members of Congress got to know one another. Now they essentially serve Tuesday through Thursday, and according to a school calendar, because they need to hustle home and fundraise. And what they're not doing is sticking around in Washington, allowing the spouses to become acquainted with one another, having a cocktail, and breaking bread. And it becomes much easier to demonize someone with whom you're unfamiliar. That's how the lack of campaign finance reform factors into all of this. Closed primaries in a state like mine in Pennsylvania, where if you're somewhat centrist or independent, you end up having to pick between two evils, a lesser of two evils. And of course, gerrymandering is a factor, and you know what that is. We take the census every 10 years, and then in many instances, the politicians get handed the marker to be able to draw the legislative boundary lines to suit their partisan objectives and not necessarily what's in our best interest. But there's something else going on that doesn't get enough attention, and that is self-sorting. And you've heard me talk about this a bit on radio. People are living near and associating with the like-minded more than they've ever done before. Consider this, that most of us live in an area that was handily won in the last presidential election or the presidential election before that was handily won by one candidate or the other, regardless if you're in a very red or a very blue state. Landslide counties are what I'm referencing. Landslide counties, counties where the margin in the presidential election was 20 or more percentage points. I want to show you some maps where landslide counties are represented in color. And what I want you to keep in mind is that we have roughly 3,000 counties in the U.S. In 1980, look at the progression of color in the maps. 80 is not reflected, but take my word for it. In 1980, there were 391 of roughly 3,000 landslide counties in the United States. Fast forward to 2020, the number is 1,726. I'll take some liberties and say nearly 2/3 of counties in the United States are landslide counties. Now, think about that for a moment, because that's not something that the politicians are doing to us. That's something we are doing to ourselves, because county boundary lines, Buncombe County boundary lines, don't change. Did I say that correctly? Close enough? Say it, shout it. Buncombe. Buncombe County lines don't change, right? Your congressional and your legislative on a state basis, they change, but not the county lines. So there's something else afoot out there beyond gerrymandering. Here's another way to think of self-sorting with a hat tip to David Wasserman from the Cook Political Report. Think about it as Cracker Barrel versus Whole Foods. Okay? Because I think in recognition of much of the data that I'm sharing with you, they largely build in different areas and they cater to different client bases. Chances are you're either a Cracker Barrel or you're a Whole Foods person, depending on whether you value fixins or fair trade labels. And if you have both nearby, as I do, in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, then chances are you live in a swing area. Well, the gap between counties that have a Cracker Barrel versus a Whole Foods has been growing in every recent presidential election. 1992, it's Papa Bush running against Bill Clinton. And you can see the margin is 19%. And now it's the Clinton re-election, and it's 23%. 2000 is Bush v. Gore, 31%. The Bush re-election against John Kerry, 39%. Obama, McCain, it's 43%. Obama, Romney, it's 46%. It has grown every 4 years, and by 2016, it was 52%. In 2020, Trump versus Biden, the Cracker Barrel versus Whole Foods gap is 53%. And even when we're not living next door to the like-minded, we're now connecting with them via the internet, because social media has become an accelerant poured on the already polarizing influence in America. They may call it connectivity, but it's really disconnecting us. And my point is that the combination of political polarization and self-sorting, now fueled by technology, has driven us further apart. It has denied us of the common experiences and the common purpose that we used to have to connect to one another. I have interviewed all the leading social psychologists and scientists on related subjects. It's interesting how this all came to pass. And perhaps you've heard me do these interviews. Bill Bishop, who wrote The Big Sort, Robert Putnam, who wrote Bowling Alone, Gene Twenge, who wrote iGen, Jonathan Haidt, who wrote The Anxious Generation. I should tell you that if you've not listened to the interviews, if they interest you, or if related interviews interest you, take me for a walk with one of these authors, because you can go to my website, listen to the 20-minute interviews that I've done with each. I didn't set out on a mission. Now I'm on a mission. I didn't set out on a mission to try and weave this story together. It's just that over time, the pieces of the puzzle started to fit in a way that I thought, there's a pattern here. There's a much larger issue in all of this social psychology and social science than any one issue that we talk about on a day-to-day basis. Here's the story they tell when combined. that 50 years ago in the Vietnam era, we disengaged as a society. We disengaged as a society. We had been joiners, community involvement, church, the Elks Club, the Urban League, bowling leagues, support of our local newspapers. And from that involvement came what the social scientists call social capital. That's what Robert Putnam, who wrote Bowling Alone, calls it. And in the small town in which I was raised, it makes total sense. Like when I think about it, my dad was a Rotarian. He was in the Rotary Club. My father was a high school and college football referee in the fall, every Friday night, every Saturday night. My dad was also a Rotarian. I guess I told you that. He was in the Masonic Lodge. That's the other one. Mom was similarly active in the community. She belonged to Eastern Star. She volunteered for a group called the VIA in our home community, the Village Improvement Association, which was a group of women that got together, raised money, and were able to build the first hospital of any substance in the area where I was born and raised. And by the way, Mom and Dad, they both belonged to the Moose Lodge. Well, Robert Putnam, who wrote Bowling Alone, argues that a community's level of social capital is determined by the sort of relationships that are forged in this type of environment. And that when we went our separate ways in the 1970s and no longer had that level of connectivity, we weren't there to help one another. And the people who suffer the most are the ones at the lowest level on the socioeconomic rung because they need this sort of interaction. The internet comes along, and the internet makes this all so much easier to self-sort. You know this. Today, whatever your level of interest might be in some avocation, however obscure your hobby might be, you can find somebody who shares your passion. And you never even have to leave your house. The same is true of a political mindset. You can find someone who mirrors your politics, and the internet, in a bad way, I argue, makes it easier to stick with your own. And that's where we now gather. A tipping point was 2012, because 2012 was the year when most of us now had a smartphone in our pocket. It was the year that Facebook acquired Instagram. It was the beginning of the selfie era. And for our youth, it has had enormous consequences because adolescents' social lives moved online and away from in-person contact onto smartphones and high-speed social internet platforms. And what followed? What followed for our adolescents are steep declines in teens hanging out with friends, dating, having sex. The latter might sound like, well, that's good news to parents, but it's also the start of a period of steep rises in depression and suicide. Jean Twenge wrote the book iGen. It's from Jean Twenge that I learned how much of it can be traced to smartphones. Too much time online, not enough time face-to-face. And Jonathan Haidt comes along this year writing The Anxious Generation, #1 New York Times bestseller, and reaches the same conclusion. Haidt and Twenge and others like Lenore Skenazy say that the type of free-range, play-based childhoods that most of us enjoyed have now been replaced by smartphone-based childhoods, causing the current mental health crisis. We've taught our kids that the world is a very dangerous place. We've probably taught our kids that the world is a more dangerous place than it actually is. We've become overprotective, but we haven't extended those lessons to the virtual world. What we need to do is supervise less in the real world and more in the virtual world. Jonathan Haidt advocates more unsupervised play. My parents had no idea where I was. My father had a unique whistle, and we were only playing in a 4-block area, and there was a woods nearby, but when that whistle sounded, it was not only the time for us to go home for dinner, but every other kid in the neighborhood as well. I know suddenly, like I'm the old guy, walking 5 miles to school in my bare feet, but it happens to be true in this circumstance. Haidt says no smartphones before high school, no social media before 16, and phone-free schools. Some might say, why would all of these measures be necessary? It's because the data is frightening. In 2023, the CDC released an alarming report based on a survey of 17,000 high school students. And I remember on CNN interviewing the CDC's head of this study. She said that in 30 years of collecting this type of information, they'd never seen anything like it. The trends began before the pandemic. They were made worse by the pandemic. 42% of American high school students experience persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness. 42%. Among our girls, 30% say that they've seriously considered attempting suicide. And 24% of American high school girls have actually made such a plan. Think about that. Even if it's inflated, think about that. And the news for our young men is problematic for different but related reasons. A recent headline from The Hill caught my eye. You might remember we talking about this on radio. Nearly half of young adults are single, 34% of women, 63% of men. 63% of men. Many of our young men today have very few close friends. Those with literally zero friends, which stood at 3% in 1990, has now zoomed to 15%. The Hill said that young men in their 20s today, more likely than women to be romantically uninvolved, sexually dormant, friendless, and lonely. And among the causes, a reliance on social media, and now, online porn. Because without real relationships, many of our young men are turning to an online substitute, AI girlfriends. I'll date myself again by telling you that I remember something that was called a date. They never look like that. But it meant standing in the kitchen with a push-button phone and calling her house and living in fear that the old man would answer, and I would have to talk my way through him, hoping to get to her. I remember with a very high-pitched voice calling and saying, hello, this is the true one, hello, Mr. Situitz, it's Mike Smerconish. Is Lynn there? Today, I see my sons who seem to get it all done with their thumbs. But they are missing social interaction, and they are missing lessons that come from rejection. It's no wonder that the Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, has said that the mental health crisis among our young is the crisis of our time, and recently advocated tobacco-like warnings on social media. Now, there's another aspect of this that you might not think of initially. Raj Chetty, the economist, proved that the disconnect that I'm describing is having significant financial consequences for all of us. He studied zip codes and social media relationships of 72 million Facebook users. And he found that growing up in a community connected across class lines gives kids, especially those not well off, a better chance of rising out of poverty. The New York Times put his findings on the front page of the paper with this headline: "Wealthy friends may be ticket out of poverty." And from the story, to me, the most amazing part was this: cross-class friendships, he found, cross-class friendships had a stronger impact than school quality, family structure, job availability, or even a community's racial composition. It's not rocket science. The people that you know open opportunities. And this growing class divide that we have in the United States, fueled by the internet, closes them off. Closes them off. A lot of upsetting information. The good news is that it's fixable. It is fixable. And step number one in fixing this is for each of us to assess our own level of disconnect. Which brings me to Charles Murray, who wrote a book in 2012 called Coming Apart. And he later crafted a quiz. Murray, if you read the book, remember it, or even have never heard of it, he focused on the division between working class and upper class whites. Only studied whites. Why did he only study whites? Because he was trying to show that a divergence in social cohesion is taking place that is not attributable to race. And the same lessons he found among whites, he believes also could be applied to everyone. And he crafted a quiz to make his point about the extent of the societal disconnect. I'm going to give you some of the questions from the quiz. You can just answer to yourselves as I ask about each of these. Have you ever walked on a factory floor? Have you ever had a job that caused something to hurt at the end of the day? Do you know who Jimmy Johnson is, and are you thinking NASCAR or football? Have you ever bought a pickup truck? Have you ever gone fishing in the last 5 years? How often do you eat at Denny's or IHOP? Since leaving school, have you ever worn a uniform? My favorite, have you ever hitchhiked or taken a long-distance bus trip? My kids don't believe me when I tell them this. I went to Lehigh University. Lehigh is an hour from Doylestown, where I was born and raised, an hour away by drive. I had a sign when I was an undergraduate. On one side it said Doylestown, and on the other side it said Lehigh. And my parents would drop me at the busiest intersection in town, and I would, as we would say, thumb it to school. Hour ride, I'd get there in an hour 15 or 20 without fail. I can remember hitchhiking home from the Jersey Shore. If you live in the Philadelphia area, you go to the Jersey Shore. Okay, that's where you spend your week of vacation in the summer. I remember hitchhiking home with a sign from the Jersey Shore. That's a 2-hour trip. I made it in 2:30. I got picked up by a carload of girls from a neighboring town, and I was wearing cologne. Have you ever watched an episode of Dr. Phil all the way through? What does Branson mean to you, Missouri or Richard? I'm keeping it nonpartisan. I will not ask what Brandon means to you. Murray said that these questions could be answered by ordinary Americans without fail, in a heartbeat, but that the quiz was designed to show some of us in the new upper class how isolated we've become, how disconnected we've become. If you had a lot of yes answers as I was going through the quiz, well, congratulations, because the more you answered yes, the thinner, Dr. Murray says, your bubble, the less your divide. And he argued in his book that when the better off among us are living in real or virtual gated communities, and he used Belmont, Massachusetts as his example. Belmont is where Mitt Romney lived when he was the governor of Massachusetts. If you live in Belmont, Massachusetts, chances are you're disconnected now from the poor of, say, and he used Kensington in Philadelphia as his example, which is now best known as an open-air drug market. The less fortunate are the ones who are suffering the greatest opportunity loss because they don't get the social capital that my parents and your parents and maybe you have enjoyed coming from community involvement, or the cross-class friendships that Raj Chetty proved when he studied the Facebook patterns and zip codes of connecting one another together. So it raises the question, how do we reconnect? How do we reestablish the common ties that I hope I've convinced you are lacking today? I have been on Bill Maher's program on several occasions. One didn't go well. Please don't Google it. Don't add to that count. But I appreciate Maher's insights and his humor. And not always, but often I do. And he concludes each program, with new rules and a commentary. And in 2022, he ended a program with a 3 or 4 minute commentary, very much tracking with what I'm telling you today, except he delivered it more colorfully. And what Bill Maher said was that our real division isn't between red and blue. It isn't between red and blue. It's between the people on both sides who aren't willing, he used the word, to mingle with Americans outside their political tribe so that they have no idea what they're really like. Mingling. Where do we go to mingle? How about going back to the workplace? I, for one, was excited to see, it'd be interesting to see the way this plays out, Amazon saying they now want people back in the workplace. 22 million Americans are fully remote. 22, but you know what they're missing? They're missing interaction with people from different backgrounds. among other things. They're missing, I think about my experience before I was in broadcasting full time and what it was like to be in a law firm 5 days a week. I had work buddies. I had lunch partners. I had somebody to go to happy hour with. This might be politically incorrect to say, but there was romance in that law office. The Wall Street Journal reported that the share of U.S. workers who know their co-workers on a personal level was 80% before the pandemic. It's now 67%. I'm shocked it's even that high. Another concern, I told you that there's a social cost, in my opinion, a social cost when kids aren't taking the public school bus together. Well, here's something related. How about when they don't even go to school? Because we currently have, talked about this on radio as well, an absenteeism crisis. Roughly 1 in 4 students, public school students, 2022-2023 school year, 1 in 4 were determined to be chronically absent, which means they missed at least 10% of the school year. That's 18 days. That's 18 days. If you were like me, you probably missed, I don't know what, 1 to 2 days of school a year back in the day. My producer, TC, and by the way, how great is she? She never missed a single day, K through 12. A single day, K through 12. The workplace, schools, there are Mingle opportunities all around us. They're as close as your front yard. This one had never occurred to me until I read about this study. It's from the University of Buffalo, and it pointed out that homes with front yards with lush plantings and porches and trinkets, they can capture the attention of passersby because they're inviting and they can spark conversation. Other lawns say stay away with fencing or foreboding signs. In this study, they looked at 1,000 front yards in a neighborhood called Elmwood Village in Buffalo. And they found that the livelier the front yard, the more connected it was between that resident and their neighbors. Dr. Putnam, who wrote Bowling Alone, suggested to me other locations, other outlets when we can mingle, attending live sporting events, going to see live entertainment, which, by the way, you've done today. Yeah, I love it. Movie theaters, community playhouses, concerts, even if you can, watch it on television. Student exchange programs, houses of worship. You might have religion in common, but little else. How about volunteering for a local nonprofit? Yeah, in Philadelphia, we have this pioneering day of service on Martin Luther King Day. Good friend of mine, Todd Bernstein, is responsible for what it's become. It's a national model. And maybe it's time for mandatory government service, not necessarily military, but some type of giving back along strangers. My dad often told me how he benefited from his Korean War experience. He never got near Korea. He spent most of the Korean War as a surveyor of all things in Germany. But he would love to tell the stories about day one, people from all walks of life, all backgrounds, all across the country, suddenly reduced to the same haircut, uniform, cot, and food. And where you came from didn't matter. People were united in purpose in terms of serving in the military as one. Except today, each branch of our armed services is struggling to meet their recruitment goals. So it's become a problem. Fewer Americans are choosing to serve their country in this fashion, and the responsibility seems to be heaped on the same families because it's like father, like son. Something else I hadn't thought of until getting into this subject and studying the data. The military is theoretically accessible. Lower income share a disproportionate burden, but it's theoretically accessible to individuals of all income levels. But the same is not true for other Mingle opportunities. The American Enterprise Institute did its own study of social capital. The author of the study was a guest of mine on radio within the last few weeks. And they found that people with high school diplomas or less, spend fewer hours in public spaces, in hobby groups, in community associations than those with college degrees or higher. and they are less likely to host friends in their home, less likely to entertain. The point is, we need to be mindful that not all have equal opportunity to mingle, as strange as that may sound. Another thought. According to the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern, since 2005, we've lost 2,900 newspapers in the United States. For frame of reference, how many do we have left? About 6,000. And today, more than half of all counties in the country have either no local news source or only one remaining outlet, and it's typically a weekly newspaper. Nothing wrong with weekly newspapers. I love them. They're often the ones with the local sports score and the honor roll and the obituaries. This is mine, where I'm from, the Bucks County Herald. And I love this paper, and I love papers like it. And what occurs to me is that we have to support them, often because they're not just ink and paper. They're often the glue that holds our communities together. In short, we need to have common experience. And to that end, I have one more book recommendation for you, really special. The book is called The Good Life, and it was written by a psychiatrist and a psychologist, both from Harvard, Robert Waldinger and Mark Schultz. Also guests of mine. You can hear the interviews if you're inclined. We can talk about Harvard on a different day. The book is about the search for happiness. And researchers at Harvard have been studying the same group of people with that idea in mind since 1938, with the goal of unlocking the answer to the age-old question of what makes a good life. Now, this is really interesting because originally there were 724 participants. 268 of them were sophomores at Harvard. And by coincidence, they included future President John F. Kennedy and future editor of the Washington Post, Ben Bradley. The group lacked diversity, and so they then added 456 additional subjects who were less privileged inner-city Boston boys. And then as time went on, they expanded that pool to include 1,300 of their descendants. Now, if you're in that pool, here's what's expected of you. Every 2 years, you have to answer lengthy and intrusive questionnaires. Every 2 years. Every 5 years, you have to surrender all of your medical records. And every 15 years, they'd come, knock on your door, and sit for a full day of personal interview. Despite what I've just told you, the retention rate among the participants is 84%, which tells me they must see value in having to be so forthcoming about their personal lives. So, what did the researchers learn? Surveys say today, if you ask young people, what kind of a life do you hope for? Often they say, I want to be rich and I want to be famous. Neither of those, according to the Harvard study, is the key to a good life. Instead, the key to a good life is social fitness. Good relationships keep us happier, healthier, and allow us to live longer. In other words, people most satisfied in their relationships at age 50 are the same individuals who will be healthiest mentally and physically at age 80. I can think of someone who would not be surprised with that data and what I've just shared with you. Mr. Larlick, my bus driver. Because in preparing to speak to you, I grew curious as to who was the man who drove me on bus number 5 to the Doyle Elementary School. So I Googled his obituary. Short, but a treasure trove. I learned that he died in 1998 at age 85, and that he was so much more than my bus driver. It turns out that Mr. Larlick was a veteran of World War II, served in the Navy in the South Pacific. He was a sub-tender. That's what they called it. He worked in support of keeping our submarines operational. And not only that, Mr. Larlick was an example of everything I've described. He belonged to his local American Legion. He belonged to something called the Percy Owls Club. Like my parents, he was a member of the Moose Lodge, the Union Horse Company, Kelly's Notre Dame Society, and the Doylestown Manor Corps Society. He was married to the same woman, Catherine, for 61 years. They are buried side by side in my hometown. And together they had 2 children, Linda and Edward. Edward has passed. But in wanting to know more about Mr. Larlick, I searched for and found his daughter, Linda, and had a lovely conversation learning more about her dad. It was actually kind of funny because I called her on a Saturday. Very hard to find people these days who don't have websites and so forth. I didn't know. Directory assistance doesn't exist anymore. So I called this house and a female voice answered and I said, "Is this Linda Larlick?" And she said, "Yes." "Who's calling?" And I said, "This is Michael Smerconish." And she said, "I just watched you on CNN." And I said, "Your dad was my bus driver." And she said, "Bus number 5?" She told me that her dad was an orphan and that Mr. Larlick benefited from something called the Boys Brigade, a Scottish version of the Boy Scouts that helped disadvantaged young men, founded by someone in our community named George Murray. Murray, it turns out, was an illiterate roofer who used his meager income to cobble together this makeshift basketball court, rudimentary basketball court in the town where I was born and raised. As a matter of fact, author James Michener is also from my hometown. Michener wrote that he was saved by the gathering spot created by George Murray. So too was Mr. Larlick. Linda Larlick told me that her father didn't regularly go to church, but that he never missed the annual service that was held in honor of George Murray. In short, Mr. Larlick mingled. Go forth and mingle. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. You know, I talk a lot of politics. I talk a lot of politics on radio and television. The television work has raised my profile. It has made me sometimes recognizable in a way that people flying here, great example, will stop and engage me in conversation. When I did radio only, and especially before there was social media, I could fly beneath the radar screen. If they are radio listeners, there's a difference between people who watch me on CNN and don't really understand and appreciate what all of you appreciate, which is what we do on a day-to-day basis on the radio program. And thank you for listening to the radio program. I know you do. But I've noticed something, and that is that when radio listeners stop and want to engage with me, it's often not about politics. It's often about conversations that I have led that fit my radio inspiration. And I'm not talking about Paul Harvey. I'm not talking about Rush Limbaugh. I'm not even talking about Howard Stern. I'm talking about Larry David, who not exactly a radio person, right? But I am a big fan, as you know, of Seinfeld and Curb Your Enthusiasm. And I'll bet some of you remember season 4, Jerry and George were going to pitch NBC on a television program that they had in mind, which was to be about what? Nothing. Right, nothing. So my favorite radio programs, and seemingly those of the audience, are the shows about nothing, except it occurs to me now that they are really about something special. They're about those issues that allow us to mingle on the airwaves, subjects where you don't need to be a Republican, you don't need to be a Democrat in order to have an opinion. In short, stories about life. So I want to close with 2 examples. Example number 1 of just a story about life, about which I am still asked to this day, stems from August of 2009. In August of 2009, I was privileged to be invited to conduct President Obama's first live radio interview from the White House. I was told I would have 30 minutes, and I did, and that it would be one-on-one, and that it would be carried live if there were interest from CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC, and that happened. I remember being nervous. I remember that I was doing a tremendous amount of preparation, and that I solicited advice from the listening audience as to questions that would be appropriate for the president. And everybody, it seemed, had a question of what I needed to ask. You need to ask this. You need to ask that. And that thinking extended to my own family, where in family dinner the night before going to Washington to conduct this interview, one of our sons said, "Dad, make sure you ask him about the Book of Secrets." And I said, "Okay, remind me." "Well, Dad, when he became president, he got the book and it told him who killed Kennedy, what's in Area 51, and did we really land on the moon?" We had just seen National Treasure 2 with Nicolas Cage, and that's why it was top of mind. I had no interest or expectation of asking any such question, except the president arrived 2 or 3 minutes early, and I was on a commercial break, and I now had to make stupid talk with the President of the United States and didn't want to leave in the locker room any of my planned substantive questions. So, of course, he sat down, and I asked him, "What's in the Book of Secrets?" He had a great reply. He said, "I'd tell you, but I'd have to kill you." The interview that followed was 30 minutes of substance, okay? No boxers versus briefs. We talked about the Affordable Care Act, which had not yet been passed. We talked about the hunt for bin Laden. He'd not yet been found. We talked about a program that was then big, Cash for Clunkers. Covered all the substance. But the following day, the headline from the Associated Press, in newspapers all over the country, our kids, especially when they were younger, have accounted for my best radio material over the years. And none better than when our daughter was 8 and she thought that she was ready to go away to camp. We weren't so sure, but we didn't want to hold her back. And so we delivered her, my wife and I delivered her one Saturday, 8 hours from home. Camp Merrimack, Black Mountain, Asheville, North Carolina. Now, it was supposed to be 2 weeks. No internet, no phone, no communication. So, of course, when we went home to the Philadelphia area on Sunday, there was no word. There was no word from her on Monday. There was no word from her on Tuesday, Wednesday. Now my wife's in a panic. Thursday. There was no word from her until Friday, when a manila envelope arrived and was chock full of letters that she'd been writing to us, which we then assembled as best we could in chronological order. They were funny and they were heartbreaking. Anybody remember Alan Sherman, Camp Granada? Here's letter number 1. Camp is fun. At 1, we have lunch. We had today pizza with cheddar cheese, pepperoni, mushrooms, and anchovies, I think. And then there must have been some talk at the lunch table about swimming, because it ends with, "I'm off to do a test swimming and there are snakes in there." By the next letter, things are changing. "Come and get me now," all caps. "I am having no fun. Now I realized I sometimes take you for granite, Granite. I'm sorry. I'm having no fun. I miss you too much. Renee, my counselor, took me to see Miss Kay, the nurse. She thinks I'm a freak. I was literally going to die, DYE, because when I was crying, I did not get enough air. The pool has snakes, jellyfish, and frogs. Letter number 3 was to her mother. Every day I think of you and cry. Like today, it was raining, and you always take me to the movies on rainy days. I cried so much I wouldn't eat breakfast. Get me ASAP or sooner. And then we didn't know what this meant. SWAT, sealed with a tear. Letter number 4. I hate it, and I'm sick of the word y'all. Get me home or else. Yesterday, there was a talent show, and I was an Oompa Loompa in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Get me out of here right now. I'm never going to sleepover camp again. Here's my mood. So far, I've cried 28 times. Get me out of here. So you know me, I need material. I scooped up that manila envelope and went off to my radio studio. I was then doing afternoon drive in Philadelphia. I read those letters aloud, and there was an immediate gender divide among the callers. The men called, and they all said the same thing. I went to camp. I was a camp counselor. There was always a kid like yours. You better make her tough it out, or she'll be scarred for life. And then women would call. And the women would say 2 things. Number 1, they would say, how dare you invade her privacy by reading those aloud? And number 2, they'd say, you better go get her or she'll be scarred for life. As I was on air, my wife was already pulling a SEAL Team 6 rescue mission. She came home. It was great radio. And you know who told me? Republicans, Democrats, independents, communists, socialists, everybody loved it, and there was a message in that. And by the way, she went back to camp the following summer. Today, she is married, happily living in New Jersey, and 3 years ago, she and my son-in-law, I get choked up, made us grandparents. So, now you know why it was so special for me to bring the Mingle Project to Asheville. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Thank you. I'll see you on radio. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Hey, see you, Michael.
He's the bus number 5 guy.
Yeah.
He's on bus number 5. Oh, I forgot to. Hopefully he'll let Dad have it.